Welcome to this edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And despite the spring-like atmosphere here in the nation's capital, we're on that darkling plain, swept by confused alarms where ignorant armies crash by night. Or at least they seem to. And there's an element of spectacle in this, which is making me increasingly suspicious. And that might be one of our main themes today, right? Here we are now in a kind of international crisis where we've got practitioners of fake news in command in a number of important places, right? We've got the Cozy Bear, Fancy Bear, Guccifer, WikiLeaks coalition on the one side, right? Russian propaganda. Then we've got the reality TV star in the White House with his own little soap opera going on with the boss of the nihilists and the Nihilist International. Somehow his fate being a big issue. But I would say that there are elements of mass manipulation in this, and I'm going to try to establish a parallel to the work of I think, largely forgotten American historian who deserves to be recalled, right? Frederick Schuman of Williams College, in his book, Europe on the Eve, 1939, and his theory of a pre-Munich plot. Talk about that in just a minute. But let's talk about Russiagate. The basic thesis of the first part of the program is that Russiagate has been advancing by leaps and bounds, so much so that we might reasonably expect, what can we say, dire consequences, or at least some consequences for some of the protagonists, that is to say, some of the flamboyant oligarchs of the Trump campaign who seem to be running wild in their contacts with foreign powers, not just Russia, but also Turkey and quite possibly others, right? These are people interested in money. Will they be getting any legal notices anytime soon? I don't know. It's hard to say. But what we certainly have is a great desire, starting with the attack on Syria 10 days ago, or by the time you hear this, it'll be 10 days ago, the so-called wag the dog thesis. That is to say, when the domestic front is uniformly dire and unpromising and negative and threatening, then it's time to manufacture foreign crises. And it's not just the world of the movie, right? The Wag the Dog movie is, it's an important shorthand so that people understand what you're saying, right? They can refer to that quite readily because it was a widely viewed movie, right? That might be your Easter weekend viewing, Wag the Dog, right? The guy's in trouble politically on the home front, starts a war abroad. But you got to remember, when you go back to the Nixon White House and Watergate, as you get into late 1973 and early 1974, spring 74, into the summer of 1974, you have this general fear that Nixon, seeing the abyss gape before him, would try to launch a general war, some kind of an apocalyptic, cataclysmic event, in order to somehow eclipse, maybe not even save himself, but to somehow eclipse what was going on vis-a-vis him. And in particular, Nixon was suspected by some of the people around him to be preparing some kind of a nuclear emergency. We should remember that it was in October of 1973, right, sort of at the beginning of this final phase, the beginning of the final days of Watergate, we had the U.S. military going to red alert, raising the DEFCON, right, going to a higher stage of readiness, October 1973, in response to reports that the Soviet Union was going to put some airborne divisions into the Middle East in order to help the Egyptians in that war. Now, the way that story is usually told, that was done by Kissinger without telling Nixon. But who knows, right? That was the spirit of the White House. What we also seem to know is that in those final days, right, the sort of late spring and summer, early summer of 1974, there was an explicit understanding between Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, as well as James Rodney Schlesinger, the Secretary of Defense, and the instructions given by James Rodney Schlesinger to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other important U.S. generals that they would not obey orders from Nixon to launch nuclear attacks on anybody. They simply would not do it. Now, this precedent is ambiguous. It's problematic, right? You can say, is that something you want to have going on? Formalistically, there's no way to judge, right? You've got to look into the content. And if it's a case of a desperate president trying to launch foreign aggression, manufacture an international crisis in order to save himself domestically or to divert attention or deflect or any of these things, that's clearly a situation where you don't want the Joint Chiefs of Staff or other generals obeying an illegal order, right? That I think keeps us within the bounds of a system of laws, which you do want to have, that you're not going to obey an illegal order, and that a wanton attack, right, an unprovoked aggression for domestic political reasons, that would be an illegal order. So bear this in mind now, because we may be getting rather close to such situations, right? When the desperation in the White House is very great, and when the turbulence out there in the world is also great, that is when these considerations come into play. Now, let us look first of all at the sorts of things that are happening, right? And this is primarily the question of Russia-gate, Kremlin-gate, and the way in which that has been acquiring momentum, right? It has been rolling on implacably during the past week, right? Whatever else is happening, Russia-gate is happening, and I think a very, a dramatic summary of this was printed yesterday, Thursday, April 13th, in the London Guardian. And it is an account of all the countries, and there are 7 or 8 of them, that became aware of contacts between multiple personalities in the Trump campaign, on the one hand, and Russian intelligence assets on the other hand. And for a lot of them, this seems to have been done, this we can't tell, right, because you have to look into intentions, and this is hard to tell. But the pattern is that these are countries that, as a matter of custom, habit, practice, policy, they surveil Russian intelligence assets, and lo and behold, they come across lots and lots of Trump staffers who are contacting these Russian agents. And we'll see the result here in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It is the afternoon of Good Friday 2017. That is to say, the 14th of April 2017. And nice day in Washington, D.C., but the world is troubled. Now, we want to remind everybody, the events have been coming thick and fast, right? No doubt about that. you got to keep up with this stuff. You ought to be listening to me every day as much as possible. So from Monday through Thursday, you can hear a 1 hour plus program called The American System. This costs you a token fee. The subscription is a mere bagatelle. It's about as much as you're going to pay for a cup of coffee these days. Comes down to about 50 cents per show if you get the economy version of this. So subscribe to it. You got to go to americansystem.tv, 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 and sign up, right? And if you can make the sustaining contribution to support the activism, please do that, right? We're looking forward to a number of public appearances here in the springtime, hopefully including New York City. We'll have more about that next week. But now, the London Guardian. What do we have here? Just before we start, you got to remember the British have three services. Well, they have more, but the ones that they talk about, MI6, Secret Intelligence Service, that's what James Bond worked for, CIA equivalent worldwide. They've got MI5, that's sort of like the FBI, domestic intelligence, things like this. And then there's GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, located in Cheltenham. It's that striking circular building when seen from above. And that's electronic eavesdropping. That's the analog of the National Security Agency, and they have an umbilical cord, right? There's an Anglo-American sharing agreement by which GCHQ Cheltenham is linked inextricably to Fort Meade, Maryland. So whatever's known on one side is theoretically known on the other. Quite possible. So here's the word from the London Guardian as of yesterday. Britain's spy agencies played a crucial role in alerting their counterparts in Washington to contacts between members of Donald Trump's campaign team and Russian intelligence operatives, the Guardian has been told. GCHQ, Cheltenham, right? British NSA, first became aware in late 2015, before any primaries, of suspicious interactions between figures connected to Trump, on the one hand, and known or suspected Russian agents. A source close to UK intelligence said this intelligence was passed on to the U.S. as part of a routine exchange of information. They added that would be the umbilical cord if things are working the way they're supposed to by treaty. Over the next 6 months, up until the summer of 2016, a number of Western intelligence agencies shared further information on contacts between Trump's inner circle and these Russian intelligence people. Now, this is really interesting. The European countries that passed on electronic intelligence, otherwise known as SIGINT, right? Signals intelligence. Signals meaning, originally flags, but semaphores, telegraph, telephone, radio, and then later on, cable, optics, whatever. SIGINT. So here are the countries that were aware. Germany, Estonia, Poland, Australia, which is anyway, as they point out, a member of this Five Eyes, right? What we used to call echelon, right? The echelon is the Anglo-Saxon intelligence bloc, U.S., Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Australia, being one of the Five Eyes, one of the echelon powers, became aware of Trump and Trump campaign and Russians and reported that. Now, this is interesting because I think the U.S. and the British have a special umbilical cord relation, but I think among the echelon powers, among the Five Eyes of the Anglo-Saxon intel bloc, they have what amounts to automatic sharing too, and that would mean that if Carter Page was seen cavorting with some Russian, for example, then that would go to the other members of this bloc, right? In other words, if Australia knew it, then you have to figure that US, UK, Canada, New Zealand would also know it. But it doesn't end here. there's also the Netherlands and the French, the DGSE, the Directorate, the General Directorate for External Security, DGSE, Direction Générale des Services Extérieurs. Okay? So, the Guardian, in order to protect themselves against this claim coming from Judge Napolitano and Fox News, they say, we were not focused on the Trump side of this equation, the Trump campaign side, but we were looking at known Russian assets, and lo and behold, the Trump people, the Trump campaign people started to show up on those screens, right? So this is not a confirmation of the Spicer Napolitano kinds of allegations. It's also the case that the British, and you got to take this with a grain of salt, the British say the FBI and the CIA were mighty slow to appreciate what was going on because we have this U.S. law, among other things, right? The FISA law, you're not allowed to delve into U.S. persons without warrants. So the Guardian source says it looks like the U.S. agencies were asleep. The Europeans were saying there are contacts going on between people close to Mr. Trump and people we believe are Russian intelligence agencies. You should be wary of this. And the message was, watch out. There's something here that's not right. So the former head of GCHQ, Robert Hannigan, met in the summer of 2016 with the CIA boss, John Brennan, and this was done director to director. In other words, not underling to underling, staff to staff, but apparently a formal summit where they met and the stuff was handed over. At least that's the impression I get. And that's when Brennan then went into action with the Gang of Eight and so forth. The FBI, of course, was dragging its feet the whole time. Comey was not in the vanguard of anything, but a couple of more elements in this story. But this is a very, very big deal. It's the talk of the town, right? Is this why NATO was bad? Because NATO actually worked in terms of intelligence? Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's Friday, April 14th, 2017. It's Good Friday in the late afternoon here. So we're right in the critical time here on Good Friday. But continuing with the Russia Gate story, which I think is destined to loom larger in the coming weeks and months, we have an account here. You might as well go read it, right, at the Guardian website. Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, we've heard from the former head of GCHQ, Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, the CIA equivalent, says that the claim, the accusation that Trump made, saying that the British had been asked by Obama to delve into the Trump campaign, this is deeply embarrassing for Trump and the administration. The only possible explanation is that Trump started tweeting without understanding how the NSA-GCHQ relationship actually works. And we don't comment, says GCHQ, the current administration. So these meetings went on. Trump campaign people meeting with Russians in Britain, the Netherlands, and in other countries. And here's the last paragraph, right? It used to be said that the final paragraph of the final sentence represents the party line. What should happen next? One source suggested the official investigation was making progress. This would mean the Senate Intelligence Committee, House Intelligence Committee, FBI. Are they going to hear from Christopher Steele, who did the 35-page compromat dossier, unsubstantiated, except when it has been substantiated, as Maddow is always saying. The official investigation is making progress, and then we get the key quote. Quote, they, the U.S. investigators, House, Senate, FBI, maybe others, they now have specific, concrete, and corroborative evidence of collusion. Let me repeat that, because that is a lollapalooza. They now have specific, concrete, and corroborative evidence of collusion. And it means between the Trump campaign and Russia. This was always the big issue, right? This is what Schiff is always being asked about. Is there coordination? Is there collusion? Not just contacts. Not just that Russia was putting out this stuff, right? The Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear, Guccifer, WikiLeaks, all this. DC leaks, right? There is specific, concrete, and corroborative evidence of collusion, says the Guardian source. This is between people in the Trump campaign and agents of Russian influence relating to the use of hacked material. An ominous conclusion to this article. Now, we have any number of things that have surfaced in the past couple of days. I've just mentioned some of them, right? You got to essentially scan primarily the Washington Post, the New York Times, but also the Associated Press, also CNN, also NBC, and others from time to time. And what we found out is that Paul Manafort, who was the campaign manager for the critical time around the Republican National Convention, he has now been told, apparently, leaned on, that he better try to clean himself up by registering retrospectively, as a foreign agent, and that he was receiving guidance, counseling from federal officials. In other words, it looks like the Justice Department said, you better go and register as a foreign intelligence operative. The same thing happened to Flynn, you'll recall, vis-a-vis Turkey. We are also told by the Associated Press that payments to Manafort were coming in $1 million sums through a shell company in Belize. So this doesn't look good. And you've got these names that have now come up again and again and again. Flynn, right? Has he struck a deal? Is there a plea bargain? Has he turned state's evidence? Is he going to sing about the others? Carter Page, and with Carter Page, it's more stuff about him, that he is the male number one in some of that stuff, and that there was a FISA warrant already last July, apparently, according to published accounts from this week. Carter Page was the target of a FISA warrant, which said not just the Russians you're talking to, but you, Carter Page, are going to be a target of this. Manafort, we said. Attorney General Sessions is somebody else who had such contacts, which can be anything, but when you start lying about them, saying, no, I never had such contacts, and you do, well, as Senator Franken says, that was perjury to the Senate, right? Sessions. That doesn't seem to have slowed him down too much, right? He's out there at the border inveighing against the filth that comes across the border, at least in his written text. Roger Stone. And then we also have Jared Kushner, who met with Russian representatives and didn't report that at the time. Right? That had to come out months later. So this universe of people, it seems to me, are worthy of sustained attention. So that line of inquiry, I guess, is going to go on. And I think that defines the background for the events here in the foreground. The foreground are the confused alarms about ignorant armies clashing by night. That is to say, we've had the Syria strike. We've had the 60 cruise missiles shot off. We don't know how many hit the target. They say 59, but that may or may not be, right? Like everything else about this, it's all hearsay. There's no proof. There's no documentation. The Russian General Staff says no, that was not a militarily efficient attack, and quite a few of those cruise missiles might have fallen by the wayside. Some, according to some accounts, 40% or so didn't make it to the target, right? Which that might account for why the runways were still intact and why so many of the revetments, right, the hardened hangars, bunker-style hangars, why were they still intact? Well, maybe because the ones that were supposed to target them never got there. The Syria strike. Now, the big debate this week is there any proof? And, of course, the U.S. has no proof. There was a 4-page document put out at the White House at midweek. There was a long briefing with off-the-record, right, unnamed top government officials, senior administration officials, convincing the press corps that this was all real, that Assad did it, but there's no proof. Assad gave a very convincing, self-assured, and dignified interview to Agence France Presse. I think he gave one to the BBC, and he's well advised to do that because he is a convincing spokesman. He's not a madman. He's not shooting guns up in the air. He doesn't foam at the mouth. It's all calm. And he says this entire affair was 100% fabricated. There is no proof. And we'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here on the afternoon of Good Friday, April 14th, 2017. Now, the Syria strike, therefore, has occurred. Right? We'll put this. We have a list of 10 flip-flops, right? 10 volte-face, 10 complete transformations of Trump, right? Like Proteus, the shapeshifter, he's always shapeshifting. And I wonder when those poor blue-collar characters who were duped by this, when will they wake up? Who knows? I hope sooner rather than later. And a lot depends on whether it's sooner rather than later, right? Maybe we'll know something about that on Tuesday evening when we get the results from Georgia 6, the Ossoff versus the Myrmidons of the legions of greed in the Republican Party, right, in this special election. Anyway, the Syrian strike. So Assad says it's 100% fabricated, that there was no military reason. I mean, we've been through all this, especially on the Monday through Thursday program. So that's the Syrian strike. And will there be more? We don't know. We have Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley. Now, my analysis is that Nikki Haley is running for vice president or president, and she wants to be the new Sarah Palin. In other words, the resident blabbermouth, right, who spouts irrational nonsense, but by doing so, ingratiates herself with a certain stratum, right, the more imbecilic elements of the Republican base. So Nikki Haley wants to be the new Sarah Palin, and she does this by essentially threatening war, right, that there are going to be new attacks on Syria, and so forth. And, of course, the counterpart to that is Tillerson, who is a somber, sober, and stoic individual who, on the whole, is not as bad because he doesn't seem to be caught up in this Palin 2.0 operation, right? Nikki Haley, I think, a dangerous person. And, of course, an appalling representative for the United States, right? A national disgrace put on display at the United Nations. Anyway, she spouts. We'll talk about some of these debates in just a minute. We've also now had the Afghan bombing, right? The super bomb. If you go back, the powers that we're always talking about, the Wunderwaffe, right? The miracle weapon, the secret weapon in World War II didn't do too well. So we're now talking about the GBU-57, massive ordnance. This is what we didn't have yet, but this is the GBU-43. The GBU-43, 22,000-pound bomb dropped on allegedly a tunnel complex of Islamic State, right? IS. It's Afghanistan, but it's not the Taliban we're talking about. It's the branch of the Islamic State that has been active in eastern Afghanistan, near the Pakistan border. So this was the tunnel complex. Supposedly the largest non-nuclear bomb ever employed in combat. The order came from General John Nicholson, commander of U.S. forces, apparently not from Trump. This reminds me of those stories, right, that Kissinger, when he wanted to raise the DEFCON, increased the status of alerts back in the Kippur War of October 1973, he didn't wake up Nixon, according to some accounts, right? Nixon was supposedly sloshed at the time, and we don't know. I mean, we're told that doesn't go on now, but we're from Missouri, so we'll soon see. One of the largest airdrop munitions in the world. Now, the U.S. has something bigger, and that's the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. This is larger. This is 30,000 pounds, 8,000 pounds more. The GBU-43 that we've just seen is the evolution of the BLU-82 bomb. The BLU was used in Vietnam, dropped from a C-130 Hercules 4-engine cargo plane. The BLU-82 was designed to destroy the trees and the brush and so forth in an area, say, of Vietnam, so that you could then use that as a helicopter landing zone. So this is why they called it the daisy cutter, because it wipes out the vegetation in that area. The U.S., as was pointed out on cable TV last night, there is this GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator designed for heavily fortified bunker complexes, which has never been used in combat. Now, as you remember, back in the Cold War, when an issue came up like, baseball or something like this, the standard Soviet answer was always, "We invented it," right? The telephone. "We invented it." Sometimes they were right, I must say. But in this case, we're told, no, this is now Sputnik, and this is supposed to be a real news, not fake news. And we're told that the Russians have something bigger, and they may. Russia's aviation thermobaric bomb of increased power, ATBIP. Aviation thermobaric bomb of increased power. It's physically smaller than the GBU-43B, but it has a larger explosive yield, and this is thermobaric. This is the father of all bombs. This is supposedly 88,000 pounds of TNT. So they claim this is bigger. Now, the problem with that is this is disputed. In other words, this may itself be fake news. That there are, I know, German experts and some U.S. experts as well who say, no, the story that you're telling about the ATBIB is internally contradictory. You can look this up, right? I think some of the Wikipedia entries about this quote a couple of German experts who say, no, we don't believe it. We don't believe this is propaganda stuff, right? You want to be so impressive and so forth, right? You may remember in 1961, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev said, we will have a 100 megaton bomb. Andrei Sakharov allegedly convinced Khrushchev, no, a 100 megaton bomb is too much, right? You might blow the Earth out of its orbit or something like this. So the Soviets rested content with a 50 megaton bomb. This was in the it was the Berlin crisis of 1961. This is the so-called Tsar Bomba, the king of bombs, that went off at that point. So this is the strategy. Some of that stuff doesn't change, right? The approach is similar, but you get the idea now with the Afghan bomb, right? There apparently 40 ISIS people were wiped out, but the overall impression, although Trump puts on a charade that he didn't order it, or it's not clear, right? You don't know. He just says, well, you know what happened. We don't know what happened. So that's the Afghan bombing. And then the counterclaim coming from Sputnik. And is that fake news, right? It wouldn't be the first time. So is this an attempt to scare everybody else, right? When you drop the big bomb on Afghanistan, you're trying to scare Kim and the Kim regime in North Korea, DPRK, Pyongyang. Well, we'll soon see. Now, we've also got then the DPRK, right, North Korea. Yesterday evening, Thursday evening, the 13th, NBC News had various reports that a preemptive U.S. attack was possible. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. This is our Easter weekend program. We're recording here in Washington on the afternoon of Good Friday, right? A time of great solemnity, and trying to get an overview of an international atmosphere of threats, of possible escalation, of military gestures. Are we going to have a North Korean nuclear test today or tomorrow? Possible. We've got these U.S. ships coming from Singapore, I guess, and approaching the Korean Peninsula. We've got all kinds of alerts going on in Japan and South Korea, and things like this. However, I've got to get to the center of the question here. Whether or not there's going to be a North Korean missile test, or maybe more seriously, whether there's going to be a nuclear test. I think a lot of this is manipulation. In other words, it's a kind of fakery. We're in the area of fake news, and fake news, I think, also infects these things. The problem is that when you're in the area of international relations, situations that are created through fake news can turn into war by miscalculation if the fake news, if not everybody knows the fake news is fake, if the fake news takes on a life of its own, if the tensions that are part of the manipulation turn into tensions that somebody believes in, this can lead to tragic consequences. I'll just give you the example you might want to have in mind. The Pre-Munich plot of late summer 1938. There was a very good historian, Frederick Schuman of Williams College, who wrote this book, Europe on the Eve, and that would be 1939. So his idea was Sir Neville Chamberlain of Britain wanted to build up Hitler, not even appease him, but to propitiate him, to make him stronger, to give him a victory, to deliver territory, and to do everything possible to strengthen Hitler against possible internal plots or overthrow and all this other stuff. So the idea was, you remember that in the Munich crisis there were these three meetings, right? There's a meeting at Hitler's house there in the Bavarian Alps. Then there's one in Bad Godesberg in the Rhine area, right near Bonn. And then there's the third one is in the city of Munich, right? So there are 3 meetings, and the idea is that in the first meeting, Chamberlain sells out everything, and in the second meeting, Hitler says all the concessions you've made so far are no good; they're not enough. That was then, last week. That's too late. So that it's in the third meeting, chaired by Mussolini and attended by all kinds of people, right? Daladier, Chamberlain, and so forth. Multilateral meeting, the Munich Conference of September 1938. That's when the final definitive sellout is brought into play. However, what Schuman wants you to see is that as part of the orchestration of this thing, you had the creation of a war scare in Britain. That is, Chamberlain said, give everybody a gas mask. Start digging trenches in Hyde Park, right? Start creating bomb-proof shelters, right? Start stocking the underground tubes with emergency supplies and all this kind of stuff, so that you got a huge fear. And the idea was to scare the British population as much as possible so that they wouldn't reject these concessions to Hitler, who by that time was widely hated, and Chamberlain could save himself politically but carry out the appeasement of Hitler, making Hitler stronger and putting him in a position to crush the internal opposition, right? Because there were some generals who wanted to coup him at that point. So that's the pre-Munich plot. In other words, you create an atmosphere of tensions, and you use that to manipulate the population on both sides. So the idea is conspiracy theory. Well, this is Frederick Schuman of Distinguished Williams College, right, 1939, and he's an interesting character otherwise, too. So are we dealing with something like this? Certainly in the U.S.-Russian relation, this is for sure manipulation. You may remember an old song called The Mutual Admiration Society, right? We belong to a mutual admiration society. Well, this is a mutual deprecation society. In other words, Trump needs to be seen in public as clashing with Russia. And I suspect Putin needs to be seen in public clashing with Trump. Because each one of them has a problematic internal situation, right? We know more about Trump, obviously, but I think the same thing obtains for Putin. So this would go in the following way. Trump, the big threat to Trump is now, my God, The Guardian, that they say there's now evidence, there's lots of evidence of collusion. Adam Schiff has said the same thing, right? And we just had Leon Panetta, the former head of the CIA, former Pentagon chief. He goes through this list. He says Flynn, Page, Manafort, others, right? Maybe Stone. These people are at the center of interest, right? And that's going to develop. So this is a grave threat, right? Grave threat to Trump. So Trump needs to be portrayed in public as somebody he's no friend of Russia. And indeed, his son Eric unwisely blurted that out, saying, you'll never be able to say that my dad is a Russian agent anymore because, look, he's been clashing with Russia while he's bombing Syria, right? The Russians are going wild. So that helps on this side. And, of course, I think with Trump, with Putin on the other side, I won't even talk about health care in Russia, because this is a landscape of tragedy of which we know only, some of the salient points. And this would be in the countryside, right? In the provinces, in the peasant areas. The cities, I'm sure it's much different. I know some of it myself is quite comparable and quite good. But what you get in these rural areas, different story. But the main thing is, overall economics, you can say it's not Putin's fault, right? Completely, because it's got to do with these sanctions. But it also has to do with the fact that the oligarchs are allowed to run the economy and run wild and loot all kinds of assets. So it's clear, right? We have all this childish theater, right? Will Putin meet Tillerson. Will he be on time to the meeting? Yes, he'll meet him, but will he be on time? Yes, indeed, he was on time. Here, I have an example of this. Can't see the dog and pony show here. Then again, maybe golf is for you. So this is now a clash between the new Russian ambassador at the United Nations, Vladimir Safronkov. He has replaced the late Vitaly Churkin, who passed away recently, as we know. So Safronkov, but we've also got, even before we get to him, the Russian embassy in London. They have been one of the leading sources of incendiary tweets, incendiary Twitter, with zingers and so forth. And that goes back to last year, right? They attracted this attention. So there are people whose job it seems to be to make sure that the public profile of the bilateral relation is about as bad as it can be. And this is what we've heard, right? We've heard Tillerson say this is the worst situation we've ever had. One of the Russian publications said this is worse than the worst of the Cold War. And I would have to say, baloney. If you remember Berlin crisis, Cuban crisis, it's not the worst by any means. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we're told this is worse than any time in the Cold War, says a Russian editorial, I think. And Tillerson says this relation is at a low point. Yeah, except it's not. Right? Remember the Berlin crisis. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember any number of moments. This is not the worst by any stretch. But what we have now is two leaders and two political establishments in power who need the public appearance of very, very bad relations. Now, here we go. Let's get back to Safronkov. So here we have now, it's the UN Security Council this week. UN Security Council, the U.S., the British, and French, with others of that ilk, have brought in this resolution. Originally, it condemned Syria. No, that wouldn't fly at all. So they mainly had this thing saying, we want to find out who did it, but we want to interrogate the Syrian commanders here. In other words, in practice, it attributed this thing to Syria. So we have a clash between Matthew Rycroft, and remember, Matthew Rycroft is the guy left over from the Downing Street Memorandum of late 2002, right? The pre-Iraq war. This is the guy who apparently wrote that famous line, the facts and the intelligence are being fixed around the policy, meaning we want to bomb Iraq, we want to invade Iraq even, we want regime change in Iraq, and we are manufacturing and falsifying the facts and the intelligence to suit that end. Oh my heavens. And it even happens now still today. So Rycroft, with that background, gets into a fight with Safronkov, because Rycroft is incendiary, right? So at a certain point, Safronkov says, he starts wagging his finger at him, right? How dare you? Look at me. Don't you look away from me. Why are you looking away? Don't you dare insult Russia again, says Safronkov, the Russian representative ambassador to Matthew Rycroft, the British ambassador to the United Nations. So, and he addresses him in the second person singular, in other words, the familiar form, not vui, but tui. Okay, what do you think that is? To me, this looks like a script, right? In other words, the guy starts off with the idea, I'm going to manufacture one hell of an incident today, and that's the idea. So the word has gone out, and even if the word hadn't gone out, the intelligent operative, the intelligent chinovnik, apparatchik, knows what to do on both sides, right? On each side. So I think we're getting that. Now, when we get to DPRK North Korea, you will have noticed that Trump had hit rock bottom in the Gallup tracking poll, 35% support. And thanks to the Syrian cruise missile attack, he had gained 5 points, up to 40% approval. Now he's 15 points lower than the lowest post-World War II president at this point, which was Clinton with 55% at this point in April of Clinton's first term. But still, Trump would say, well, 5 points are 5 points, and we've gained 5 points. What I was trying to warn people about all last week was, if you teach this White House the lesson that aggression, Syrian cruise missile attack, leads to adulation, right? Oh, you finally became president, says Fareed Zakaria, or other kinds of nonsense, right? You're really presidential when you push the cruise missile launch button. Then, if you teach this White House aggression gives you adulation, then that will lead to a habit, and it's habit forming. It's going to be an addiction. So we go from aggression to adulation to addiction. So you become addicted to aggression. And this, of course, this is, the story of a million tyrants in world history, right? And if people are starving, if domestic affairs are going badly at some, point in the past, well, then, try to export your problem with an aggression, right? By attacking some neighbor, and maybe you can even get some loot that will help you. That, I think, is sort of where we are. Now, the problem with that is all this stuff around North Korea, right? The first trip by Tillerson to the Far East. Well, by that time, the Russiagate handwriting was on the wall, right? The Russiagate handwriting was on the wall on January 20th, right, on the day of the inauguration. But when Tillerson went to the Far East, the idea was to try to get everybody in the world, if possible, to gang up on North Korea. So then Tillerson says, our policy of strategic patience is over. And then when the North Koreans act up again, he says, we've said everything that has to be said about North Korea, and we're not going to say anything more. Is this histrionics, play acting? Are we supposed to be quaking in our boots? Obviously, we're concerned. There's so much to be said about this. If you want to be, want to take the darkest possible view, from the U.S. point of view, having a war involving North Korea would eliminate a number of important commercial competitors, if this is how you think of it, as well as harming China. In other words, if there is a war with North Korea, the 20,000 famous artillery pieces will be fired against Seoul, and 20 million people there will be under the gun, literally, and this will cause chaos. So this economic powerhouse of South Korea, Republic of Korea, ROK, will be decimated. Some of these missiles will hit Japan. Japan will, face a certain amount of chaos. And, of course, if it gets really bad, if there are radioactive clouds and things like this, those will swirl also in the direction of China. In other words, out of the main powers that would be impacted by a war involving North Korea at this point, the U.S. would be relatively distant from these actions, whereas South Korea, Japan, and China would be very much caught up in them. So you could do a lot of damage to your adversary. You could do a lot of damage to your allies if you wanted to do that. How crazy is the current administration? I guess we're soon going to find out whether we like it or not. So this is the problem. The manipulation is all fine, but if people begin to believe it and it takes on a life of its own, then you get into war by miscalculation. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, Good Friday edition. We can cite the famous aphorism, the zinger of Epicurus in the ancient world, who once said, "Satis enim magnum alter alteri theatrum sumus," right? Each person is a sufficiently large theater, let's simplify it. Each person is a big theater for every other person. In other words, we're always on display. Manipulation. And again, the manipulation is, as long as it's manipulation, it has a certain effect on public opinion. But when it takes on a life of its own and begins to influence decisions, this is when it can turn into war by miscalculation, right? Braggadocio. Braggadocio is this character in The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, right? Elizabethan, long sort of Renaissance epic. Braggadocio is the personification of vainglory, bragging, right? Being a narcissist and stuff like this. And sometimes this stuff gets you into big trouble. Now, we've heard this week that China is leaning on North Korea. Trump is congratulating himself, saying coal ships from North Korea have been turned back, except that we have today in the Washington Post a big article. The North Korean rocket program, the North Korean ICBM program, is being systematically supported by China. Even as Beijing pledges the tougher line, many Chinese firms are exporting banned technology to North Korea. Now, I won't go through all the details of this stuff, but the multi-stage rocket that North Korea used to loft a Kwangmyong-song-4 satellite into space last year, that was built with components shipped in from China. So this thing about China being the great friends of Trump and President Xi and Trump having this wonderful relationship, here's where people begin to delude themselves and begin to believe their own propaganda. All right. So therefore, what should happen? Obviously, well, the first thing is turn away from this, from this bombastic theater, right? Turn away from the Mutual Deprecation Society or the Mutual Condemnation Society, which is what you have with North Korea. And stop with the bombs. All right, you've shown you have this bomb. Great. Let's not have any more of that. What you need, two things, right? The two-track decision, traditional Western, NATO, late 1970s, two things. Negotiate. Negotiate directly with North Korea. That's what they want. Give it to them. Cost you nothing. Secondly, build anti-ballistic missile defenses, not just kinetic, but get some lasers working so that this ability of North Korea to blow up the world, that has to be neutralized. So it's time to forget about all that. And as various people say, you've got the THAAD, you've got Patriot, you've got Aegis on cruisers and destroyers, you've got anti-satellite weapons, you got all this stuff. This has to be merged into a significant coordinated program that would allow you to sit there and say to Kim, look, Kim, don't launch any of this stuff because we will swat them out of the sky, as we once heard in a James Bond movie. Now, here's the other thing. Now, I think we're approaching a real clash in Washington. The idea here being that the question of Obamacare, right? The Republican demand, ideological hysteria from Ryan and others, and from Trump, to wipe out Obamacare is the biggest single problem. It's the biggest liability this Republican regime has. In other words, when they've lost points, they've lost them on this idea that you're going to rip people's health care away and leave them more or less, to die if it comes to that, right? If you can't afford it. So what we now have is Trump threatening to go further with his original threat. You'll remember on the last Friday there of the Ryan Care, Trump Care debate, when he had to capitulate and he didn't get a win, he got a loss. He started saying, well, it's going to collapse, and that's the best thing for us. We're going to sit back and let it collapse. However, this is now a question of making it collapse. In the Affordable Care Act, there is this provision that there are subsidies. The subsidy means if you go to a private insurance company and they quote you a price, you can't afford that, you're going to get a certain amount of money to allow you to buy it. Now, the Republicans in the House have got a court case which has won. It has prevailed at the federal district level that Obama can't do that, couldn't do that. And the Obama administration attempted to overturn that by appealing to the appellate level. And that's where we are now. The appellate court, I guess it's the D.C. Circuit, is in the process of considering this question. But since Trump is now the president, Trump could simply say, that's it, we're dropping this suit, let the federal district court verdict become the case law, and that will lead to the collapse of all of these subsidies, right? All the payments that make this possible. I think about 7 million people, which means 7 million families, if you think about it, those people rely on the subsidies. So the idea is Trump is threatening to say, well, we're going to withdraw, we're going to collapse the subsidies that help reduce the deductibles and the copays for 7 million people in America on beneficiaries of Obamacare. So there is a kill switch, according to one insurance executive. This is a very potent threat coming from Trump because the administration has the authority unilaterally to do this. And this really is a kill switch. This makes the program unprofitable for the majority of health plans operating in it today. So the idea is Trump has it within his purview to say, okay, we're dropping the case, no more subsidies, and at that point it's expected, according to press accounts here, that health insurers would then flee from the program. And, of course, they're all motivated by greed, and they haven't been taught to fear anything. This is now in the lap of Seema Verma. Seema Verma, not to be trusted. Seema Verma, a Republican operative, obviously hostile to Medicare, Medicaid, but she's now the administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, right? Her job is really the deconstruction of the administrative state. She's going to have a conference next Tuesday, including various lobbyists, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, America's health insurance plans, and so forth. So what's going to happen here? According to one other person quoted here in the Washington Post, the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center, he says, my guess is that somebody has convinced Trump that this is good leverage. And the way you get health care reform passed, in other words, the abolition of Obamacare and the coming of this monstrous Trump care, Ryan care, right, with 24 million people left with nothing but their eyes to cry with. The way to get that reform passed is to get the Democrats back on board, use this cost-sharing subsidy as a hostage, force them to the table. So the Democrats have an answer. We'll get back to that, right? And that, I think, defines the political crisis here in the remainder of the month of April. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. The last segment has come up on us. You got so much more to tell. This is why you've got to come back and subscribe to the American system Monday through Thursday. So the answer from Schumer is we don't negotiate with hostage takers, which is what this is. So the idea the Democrats say, let's see how you like it if we extort you and sabotage you, Republicans. If the government is shut down, the Republicans will be blamed because that meme has been established. So the Democrats, Schumer and company, are saying we want built into any budget compromise your pledge that you won't sabotage Obamacare and that you're not going to tamper with these subsidies, right? That you're going to keep paying the subsidies. And that becomes important because as of 28th of April, April 28th is when the budget authority, the spending authority, runs out. That can lead to a government shutdown, which will be blamed on the Republicans because they command all the branches of government. But you know, of course, that those Tea Party loony birds will not be the chuckleheads, as they were called. They will not cooperate. So that's a real big fight. That's natural law. That's the general welfare. And that is where the Republicans could suddenly lose a large part of their support, setting them up for certainly defeat in the November elections. Now, I have a list of 10 flip-flops by Trump in the past week. If you want to hear that, you should go over to the American System and subscribe to that. So I think that essentially brings us up to date. We got to say something about Good Friday, frankly. The point of this is it's Good Friday, and of course the Easter, the Triduum, right? That is Friday, Saturday, Sunday. This is the center of the Christian year, and it's got one of the greatest concentrations of sacred music ever. In other words, the great composers have focused on this in a very, very significant way. And one important example is this. It's a poem from 1100 or so, the Stabat Mater. Stabat Mater. It's a Latin poem, but it's a late Latin. It's a medieval Latin poem because it doesn't operate the way Virgil or Horace or Catullus would operate, but it operates with the sort of more modern criteria. Some people say it was written by Pope Innocent III. Some people say it's written by Gioacchino di Fiore and others. So it's this. It's a Latin poem, right? Stabat Mater dolorosa juxta crucem lacrimosa dum pendebat filius. So the sorrowful mother, Saint Mary, was standing by the cross, and she was crying, she was weeping, because her son, Christ, Jesus, was hanging on the cross, right? In German, we have another effective version. Christi Mutter stand mit Schmerzen beim Kreuz und weint vom Herzen. That's a German version. And in English, let's see. At the cross, her station keeping, stood the mournful mother weeping, close to Jesus to the last. Anyway, it's an approximate translation. I would urge people delve into this. There is a website. It doesn't give you everything. It doesn't give you all the versions you want to hear, but it's called the Ultimate Stabat Mater Site. Because of composers, there are about 600 composers who have put out different versions of the Stabat Mater. And there are about 200 to 250 of these that have been recorded and that somehow can be reached in a recording. So that means there are 350 to 400 that exist but have never been recorded. So who's included? Well, Pergolesi. These are the Italians of the 1700s, right? Some of these are very distinguished, right? Every one of them has merit. Scarlatti, Pergolesi, Vivaldi, right, of Venice. Right? These are important ones. Haydn did a version of Stabat Mater. Boccherini, Paisiello, the great competitor of Rossini. But Rossini did one too. So Paisiello and Rossini, the rivalry is there too. Franz Schubert, this of course compels attention. Franz Liszt, him too. Antonin Dvorak, right, the Czech composer. Kodaly, the Hungarian. Poulenc, 20th century French. There are Russians, and there are one or two Americans. Brian Schober of the United States has done one. So this is worth following. Now, of course, there's a mass of other sacred music that revolves around this occasion. The other thing that's worth remembering is the Thursday of this week was the famous Maundy Thursday. And it's worth remembering what this was. There were two competing versions. What is that Maundy? What does that mean? It's not clear. Well, one of them is that, of course, Thursday, that was the Last Supper. That was the scene painted by Leonardo. And in the course of that, Christ said to the disciples, Mandatum novum do vobis. I'm giving you a new commandment, mandate, an order, right? That you should love each other as I have loved you, said Christ. So that would be Maundy Thursday, the day of the Last Supper. That's also when the Roman Pope, I haven't checked whether Francis did it this year, but he's done it in previous years, goes to the St. John Lateran, right, San Giovanni Laterano, which is the church. If you're the head of that, you're the Bishop of Rome, and that makes you Pope. And wash the feet. You got to wash the feet of people who are your social inferiors. That's a big, big deal. And you remember he had, Muslims and prisoners and all kinds of people that he wanted to show, right, were part of the human amalgam. And that was yesterday. And today, of course, this is the Good Friday. This is the crucifixion. And if you're ever in Rome, you want to make sure you go to the Colosseum in the late afternoon, and you're going to see the Via Crucis, the way of the cross. In other words, the stations of the cross. And those were, when I was there, I actually got to see this. It was Wojtyła, right? John Paul II, who did these. But this tradition has continued. So Maundy Thursday. The other side of the Maundy Thursday is apparently in England, where the Maundy is the strongest. There was a tradition that the poor people of London could go to Mass and they would get a little basket. Hey, the Easter basket. They'd get an Easter basket on the Thursday, and that would have, some food or a coin or something in it. And this was mendicant. Somehow the word mendicant came in, right? Mendicare, to beg. So the poor were begging for their little basket. And that's another competing explanation. So some of them would say it's Mandate Thursday, and others would say it's Mendicant Thursday. But these things are worth